The story begins with a quiet stretch of land that had been in one family's name for generations. Acres of rolling earth, untouched by the rising developments of nearby towns, carried the weight of a history too often stolen or erased. For a black woman named Evelyn Johnson, this land was more than dirt, grass, and trees. It was a sacred inheritance, the living proof that her family had fought through centuries of dispossession and injustice to hold onto something that was theirs. Evelyn's grandmother had always told her, "Baby, as long as this land is ours, they can never say we had nothing." Those words lived inside Evelyn like scripture. But the world has a way of testing the strength of those who refuse to bend. And in Evelyn's case, the test arrived in the form of a sprawling homeowners association that set its sights on building a subdivision of 96 houses. Without her permission, without acknowledgement of her rights, construction began. What was once Evelyn's quiet refuge was suddenly filled with bulldozers, surveyors, and concrete foundations. They built right on top of her property, as though her name and her claim didn't exist. To many, it may have looked like yet another case of a black woman being pushed aside, her dignity paved over by the arrogance of developers who assumed she was powerless to stop them. They didn't ask questions. They didn't check records. Or maybe they did and they simply didn't care. Either way, the developers and the HOA that followed believed Evelyn's land was theirs for the taking. They saw her as invisible. But Evelyn was not invisible. She was watchful, patient, and far stronger than anyone realized. You see, Evelyn had inherited more than just land from her family. She had inherited wisdom. Her grandmother, who lived through Jim Crow, had whispered lessons about the traps laid for black people in America and the ways to turn those traps back on those who set them. Her father, a man who worked double shifts but never let go of the soil, taught her the value of documentation. Keep your papers, keep your proof. And Evelyn herself, with her sharp mind and degree in law, had spent years learning the systems designed to exclude people like her. She knew how they worked. She knew their weaknesses. So when the HOA built 96 homes on her land, Evelyn did not rage publicly. She didn't run to the construction site screaming for them to stop. Instead, she did what her ancestors had always done when confronted with theft, masked as progress. She watched. She gathered and she waited. Evelyn knew they were walking right into her trap. At night, when the machines went silent and the workers disappeared, Evelyn would walk the edges of her property, her boots pressing against soil that was both wounded and alive. She carried her grandmother's Bible, her father's ledgers, and her own carefully organized files, deeds, surveys, maps, and records dating back decades. Every nail hammered into her land was another piece of evidence, another line in the story she was quietly writing. She let them build, because the higher they built, the harder they would fall. It wasn't easy. Every day she had to watch the erasure of her family's presence. She saw trees cut down that her grandfather had planted. She saw markers disappear under asphalt. She saw new families moving in, smiling at their shiny houses, never knowing the ground beneath them was not legally theirs. And still she did not flinch. She knew what was coming. Evelyn's trap was not born of revenge. It was born of justice. She wanted the world to see what it meant when black ownership was disregarded, when black women were assumed powerless, when systems thought they could erase dignity without consequence. So she waited until every home was complete, until the HOA had formally established itself, until the illusion of their authority was at its strongest. And then she moved. With the weight of generations at her back, Evelyn filed her lawsuit. The documents were impeccable, layered with history and law. She was not merely claiming trespass. She was proving ownership in a way that could not be denied. She had deeds signed before many of the HOA members were even born. She had tax records showing her family had paid faithfully, year after year, even when money was scarce. She had legal maps confirming the boundaries the developers had ignored. And when she stepped into the courtroom, she carried herself with the calm of someone who had been underestimated her entire life and had learned how to turn that underestimation into strength. The HOA arrived confident, with expensive lawyers and a belief that money could bend truth. But they underestimated Evelyn the same way the builders had underestimated her land. They spoke of development, progress, and community growth. They painted her as a nuisance, an obstacle to modern living. But the judge did not care for polished speeches. The judge cared for evidence. And Evelyn's evidence was undeniable. Each time she spoke, her words carried the weight of a century's worth of silenced voices. She spoke not only for herself, but for every black family whose land had been stolen, every ancestor forced off fertile ground, Every generation told they owned nothing. Her case became more than property lines. It became a reckoning. What the HOA had not realized was that Evelyn's silence all those months was not weakness, it was strategy. They had walked willingly into a legal snare, investing millions into homes built on soil that was never theirs. 96 houses stood as monuments to their arrogance, and now every one of those houses was under her control. The moment the ruling came down in her favor, the room fell silent. Evelyn had won. The HOA no longer owned the ground beneath their subdivision. Evelyn did. And by law, every homeowner, every brick, every blade of grass was subject to her terms. She had turned their attempt to erase her into undeniable proof of her power. The victory was not just Evelyn's, it was a victory for every black woman who had been told she was powerless, every family whose inheritance had been swallowed by greed, every story of quiet resistance that the world had ignored. Evelyn's trap was not only legal, it was symbolic. She had shown what happens when history is respected, when dignity is defended, and when patience becomes the sharpest weapon. And yet this was not the end, because winning the case was only the beginning. Evelyn had a choice. What to do with the 96 homes, with the HOA that had stolen from her, with the land her ancestors had preserved for her to protect. What she decided would not only shape her future, but would echo as a lesson about justice, ownership, and the power of never underestimating a black woman who knows her worth. Her lawyers reminded her of the power she now held. She could demand rent from every homeowner, turning their arrogance into financial submission. She could dissolve the HOA altogether and reclaim the subdivision as her private property. She could sell or she could rebuild. But Evelyn wanted something larger. She wanted to use this moment to teach the nation about the fragility of ownership when justice is ignored, and about the strength of black legacy when it is defended. So she began to plan, not out of haste, but with the same patience that had carried her through the quiet months of watching the construction unfold. Evelyn envisioned transforming the subdivision into a living testament of what it meant to protect one's heritage. She spoke with community leaders, black historians, and activists. She imagined scholarships funded by the land, programs for young black entrepreneurs, spaces dedicated to telling the story of how easily a legacy can be stolen and how powerfully it can be reclaimed. The media called it Evelyn's trap, but to her, it was not a trap. It was a lesson, a mirror held up to a society that assumed land was just property, when in truth, it was memory, bloodline, and dignity. She wanted to turn the subdivision into something no one could ignore, proof that when a black woman refuses to be erased, she can not only reclaim her inheritance, but also redefine the meaning of ownership itself. But before she could build, she had to face the 96 homeowners. A town hall was arranged, and Evelyn walked into the room with the same calm strength that had carried her through the courtroom. The tension was sharp. Some glared at her with open hatred, others looked down in shame, and still others clung to desperate hope. Evelyn did not falter. She spoke slowly, each word carrying the gravity of her decision. "I know many of you feel fear right now," she said. "You bought homes believing they were yours. But the truth is, this land has always been mine. My family kept it alive through slavery, segregation, and discrimination. And when the HOA built on it, they tried to strip me of that legacy. But I stood firm. And now, I have a choice. To take everything from you the way everything has been taken from us. Or to chart a new path." A hush fell over the room. Evelyn paused, then continued. "I will not evict you. I will not tear down your homes, but I will not let my family's inheritance be ignored any longer. This land is under my ownership, and if you wish to remain here, it will be with acknowledgement of that truth. You will pay fair rent, not to an HOA that lied to you, but to me, the rightful owner, and part of that rent will go toward building something greater: scholarships for young black students, programs for black farmers, and preservation of the history too often erased from this country's soil." Some residents erupted with anger. Others broke into applause. But all of them understood. Evelyn was in control and her justice was undeniable. News of her decision spread nationwide. Activists hailed her as a symbol of resilience. Scholars wrote about her case as a modern parable of land theft and restitution. And young black women saw in Evelyn a reflection of themselves, a reminder that their worth, their legacy, and their strength could never be dismissed. As months passed, the subdivision changed. The HOA dissolved, replaced by Evelyn's stewardship. Rent checks carried her name. Families who once saw her as an enemy began to understand the story of the land they lived on, the history buried beneath their driveways. Some even joined her in building community programs, realizing their homes were part of something bigger than themselves. Evelyn often walked her land at dusk, just as she had when the construction first began. The houses were still there, but now they stood not as monuments to her erasure, but as evidence of her power. The trap had sprung, not to destroy but to reveal. She had turned theft into testimony, arrogance into humility, invisibility into undeniable presence. In the end, Evelyn's story was not only about 96 homes built on stolen land. It was about the weight of history, the courage to defend dignity, and the brilliance of a woman who refused to be silenced. She had shown the world that Black ownership was not fragile, not disposable, not something that could be paved over without consequence. She had turned her inheritance into a weapon of truth. And long after the headlines faded, the land still spoke her name. Evelyn Johnson, a Black woman who refused to be erased. A woman who reminded the world that justice, when claimed with patience and pride, can transform even the deepest wound into a legacy of power. Time has a way of testing whether victories are fleeting or eternal. Her triumph in court was not the end of a story, it was the beginning of a legacy. The ink on the judgment was barely dry when she realized that her fight had pushed her into a role she had never sought but could not refuse. She was no longer just a landowner. She had become a symbol. Across the country, Black families who had endured land theft for generations began to write to her. Some sent letters filled with gratitude, saying that her case gave them the courage to look again at their own family deeds and maps. Others sent stories of heartbreak, of farms lost to shady developers, of homesteads swallowed by eminent domain, of ancestors who had watched their inheritance disappear without a trace. Evelyn read every word. She cried, she prayed, and she promised herself that her victory would not be hers alone. The subdivision that once mocked her, invisibility, was now the ground. Zero of a movement. Evelyn began transforming the houses not physically but spiritually. She launched the Johnson Legacy Foundation, using a portion of the rents collected to create scholarships for young Black students in law, agriculture, and business. She wanted them to know that ownership was power, and that knowledge was the fence that protected that ownership. She wanted the next generation to understand the traps society set for them, and how to set their own traps of justice in return. Soon every child in the subdivision knew Evelyn's story. Some families resisted at first, clinging to their bitterness, refusing to acknowledge the truth. But their children heard it anyway, in schools, on the news, in whispered conversations at community events. And slowly, even the most reluctant residents began to realize that living on Evelyn's land meant living inside history. Their homes were no longer just homes, they were classrooms in dignity. Evelyn herself often wrestled with the balance between justice and forgiveness. At night, she would sit on her porch with the old Bible her grandmother left her, turning its pages with weathered fingers. She remembered how her grandmother had survived entire decades without justice, how her father had clung to the soil even when money was scarce. And she knew that while eviction might have satisfied the urge for revenge, true victory lay in turning pain into possibility. She had not destroyed 96 families. She had forced them to reckon with history, to face the truth that comfort built on injustice is fragile. Her story gained national attention. Documentaries were filmed. Universities invited her to speak. She stood at podiums in rooms filled with students, scholars and activists, telling them how she watched the homes go up, knowing they were building their own downfall. "I didn't stop them," she would say, her voice calm but firm. "I let them build. Because I knew what they didn't, that this land was not theirs to claim. I let them build so the world could see what happens when arrogance meets history." The impact was staggering. Cases of land theft resurfaced across the country. Families who had long given up began to dig through county records, searching for deeds and maps. Some discovered mistakes, others uncovered outright fraud. Evelyn's victory became a blueprint for justice, proof that even in a system stacked against the vulnerable, patience, knowledge, and strategy could bend the arc toward dignity. But not everyone celebrated her. There were critics who said she exploited the situation, who claimed she should have just sold the land or moved on. Evelyn ignored them. She knew that criticism was simply the sound of discomfort, the discomfort of a nation forced to look at its reflection. She had not created the problem. She had exposed it. Within the subdivision, change began to bloom. What was once the HOA's sterile, Rule-driven community became something more organic under Evelyn's leadership. She organized gatherings where residents learned about the land's history. Local historians gave lectures in the community hall. Children painted murals honoring black farmers and landowners who had come before. Every brick in those 96 homes began to carry new meaning, not as monuments to stolen land, but as reminders of what it means to restore what is rightfully yours. For Evelyn, the most emotional moment came 2 years after the ruling. On Juneteenth, she hosted a celebration on her land. Families gathered, food filled the air with rich aromas, and music carried across the subdivision. At sunset, Evelyn took the microphone. Her voice trembled as she looked out over the crowd, not with fear, but with the overwhelming weight of legacy fulfilled. My grandmother told me that as long as this land is ours, they can never say we had nothing, she said. Today I stand here on this very soil knowing she was right. They tried to erase us. They tried to build over us. But we are still here, stronger, louder, unshakable. The crowd erupted in applause, and for the first time, Evelyn felt not only victorious but at peace. She realized that her trap had not only caught the HOA, it had caught the nation's attention, forcing a reckoning with how easily black ownership was dismissed and how powerful it became when defended. Years later, Evelyn's story was taught in classrooms. Law students studied her case as precedent. Children grew up reciting her name as a symbol of resilience. And through it all, Evelyn continued to walk her land at dusk, breathing in the smell of earth, feeling the pulse of her ancestors beneath her feet. She knew that her fight was bigger than 96 homes, bigger than one HOA, bigger even than herself. It was about reclaiming space, memory, and voice in a world that had tried to strip all three away. She had turned her inheritance into a weapon of truth, her patience into a lesson, her dignity into a fortress no one could tear down. And so the story of Evelyn Johnson lived on, not just in books, not just in documentaries, but in every black child who looked at the ground beneath their feet and said, "This is mine. This is ours!" And no one can erase it. Her trap had worked. But more than that, her vision had endured. Evelyn had shown the world that justice is not only about winning battles. It is about rewriting the future, 1 acre at a time. Time, as always, moved forward. The subdivision matured, children grew, trees replanted by Evelyn's hands began to rise again, and what once had been a battlefield of law and dignity slowly became a thriving community. But Evelyn knew that memory fades if not carefully tended. Victories left untold are victories easily erased. She carried with her the responsibility to ensure that her story, her family's story, would not become another buried chapter in the long history of black struggle and resilience. As the years passed, Evelyn transitioned from fighter to teacher. Universities continued to call her, not only to lecture about land rights, but to share her philosophy of patience, strategy, and legacy. Land, she would tell students, is not only wealth, it is a map of survival. It is memory etched into soil. If you forget that, you forget yourself. Her words inspired young lawyers, activists, and everyday people to take a closer look at their own family inheritances. Across the country, black families began tracing deeds, filing claims, and standing taller when discussing ownership. Evelyn had become a quiet revolution. Her influence reached policymakers. Conversations about reparations, land theft, and restitution began to circulate in city councils and state legislatures. Evelyn herself testified before committees, her steady voice cutting through bureaucratic jargon with piercing clarity. "I am not asking for charity," she declared once before a chamber of lawmakers. "I am asking for recognition of what has always been ours, and justice for what has always been stolen. My fight was one subdivision. How many more Evelyns are waiting, unseen, unheard?" Her words hung in the air, undeniable, unforgettable. But her personal journey was not without cost. Evelyn carried the weight of being a symbol, and symbols rarely find peace. Neighbors still occasionally challenged her authority, though more quietly than before. Developers across the state whispered her name with a mix of resentment and fear, seeing her as a thorn in their industry. She faced threats, slander, and attempts to undermine her. But Evelyn had lived too, long under the shadow of dismissal, to be shaken by shadows of hate. She met resistance with the same calm strength she had shown from the beginning. The children of the subdivision grew up knowing Evelyn not as a distant figure, but as a living elder in their community. They called her Miss Johnson, sometimes Grandma Evelyn. They sat at her feet as she told stories of her grandmother's survival, her father's struggles, and her own choice to watch as the houses went up, knowing she would one day bring them down with truth. They learned from her not just history, but how to hold themselves with dignity in a world eager to strip it away. For them, Evelyn was not only a landowner, she was the embodiment of justice living among them. Years later, one of those children, now a young woman, stood before a college audience and declared she was pursuing law because of Evelyn. "She showed me that we can win," she said. "She showed me that being underestimated can be your greatest strength. And she showed me that no one can erase us if we refuse to disappear." Evelyn, sitting quietly in the back, wept silently as she realized that the seed she had planted had grown beyond her reach. The land itself began to change. Evelyn dedicated part of it to a community garden, open to everyone but rooted in Black agricultural traditions. Rows of collard greens, sweet potatoes, okra, and corn sprouted under the careful hands of volunteers. Elders taught the younger generation how to work the soil, how to respect it, how to see it not just as food but as connection. Each harvest festival became a celebration, not only of crops but of heritage, an affirmation that the soil carried memory, and that memory nourished the future. The subdivision also gained a museum, built in one of the larger houses, curated with Evelyn's family documents, photographs, and oral histories. Visitors walked through rooms lined with maps, deeds, and stories of resilience. They learned how easily Black families had been erased from property lines, and how courage and patience had restored Evelyn's name to the land. The museum became a pilgrimage site, visited by school children, scholars, and activists who wanted to witness living proof that erasure could be reversed. Evelyn lived to see her story adapted into books and films. She watched as young Black women played her on screen, their voices trembling with the same anger and triumph she had once felt. She saw herself transformed into art, into symbol, into something larger than the quiet woman who had once walked the edges of her land at night, clutching her papers, whispering to her ancestors. But perhaps her proudest moment came when the U.S. Supreme Court cited her case as precedent in a ruling involving another Black family fighting land theft. The legal language was cold, as legal language often is, but Evelyn understood its power. She had shifted the foundation of law itself. What had begun as one woman defending her inheritance had rippled into a structural change that could protect generations to come. As her years grew long, Evelyn began to think often about what she would leave behind when she was gone. She wrote letters to her nieces and nephews, reminding them that the land was not only theirs to own, but theirs to guard. She recorded oral histories so her voice would live on. She even set aside part of her foundation's resources to protect other families from predatory developers, ensuring her fight would continue long after her body returned to the earth. On her final birthday, surrounded by neighbors, students, and family, Evelyn stood once more on her porch. The air was thick with summer heat, cicadas humming in the distance. She looked out over the subdivision, 96, homes that had once mocked her existence and now testified to her power. She smiled, her voice thin but strong as she whispered, "We are still here." When Evelyn Johnson finally passed, the town mourned not just a woman but a chapter of history embodied in flesh. Her funeral overflowed with people, residents, activists, politicians, and strangers who had been moved by her story. They carried her casket through the subdivision, past the gardens, past the museum, past the homes that stood because she had chosen justice over vengeance. And as they laid her to rest on her own land, the land her ancestors had protected for her, a hush fell across the crowd. A child's voice broke the silence, soft but sure. "Miss Johnson will take care of it." And in that moment, Evelyn's legacy was secured. The trap she had set so many years before was no longer about catching an HOA or exposing arrogance. It was about planting a seed that no bulldozer, no developer, no erasure could ever destroy. Evelyn's story lived on, not only in the soil but in the spirit of everyone who knew her name. Her life was proof that when Black women defend their dignity with patience, courage, and wisdom, they do more than win battles. They change the future. They turn stolen ground into sacred ground. They remind the world that justice, when rooted deep enough, can outlive us all. Decades after Evelyn Johnson's passing, her name still lingered on the lips of those who cared about justice, dignity, and land. The subdivision, where 96 homes once stood as monuments to theft, had transformed into something far greater. It was no longer just a neighborhood, it had become a living memorial, a crossroads of memory and progress where Evelyn's vision continued to unfold. The Johnson Legacy Foundation had grown into a national institution. What began as a modest effort funded by rent from the subdivision had blossomed into an organization with chapters across the United States. Lawyers, historians, and activists worked together under its banner, investigating cases of stolen land, representing families who had been silenced for generations and creating pathways for restitution. Evelyn's story was their cornerstone, their rallying cry. She showed us we could win. In cities across the country, murals of Evelyn appeared on walls, her silhouette painted. Against the backdrop of rolling fields, her eyes steady, her hands holding the deeds that had saved her inheritance. Children in neighborhoods she had never visited grew up reciting her name in classrooms, not as a distant historical figure, but as a reminder that erasure could always be challenged. For them, Evelyn was not a ghost of the past, she was a guide for the future. The museum in her subdivision expanded into a national archive. Scholars donated collections. Families contributed documents of their own, and the Johnson Archive became the largest repository of Black land, ownership records in the country. What had once been hidden in dusty courthouses and forgotten attics was now carefully preserved, digitized, and made accessible to anyone searching for their roots. Visitors walked through its halls and found not only Evelyn's story but hundreds of others. Stories of resilience, theft, resistance, and reclamation. Her trap had not only caught an HOA, it had trapped the nation's attention long enough to uncover truths, buried beneath generations of silence. Meanwhile, Evelyn's land itself continued to breathe with life. The gardens flourished, feeding not just the community, but also serving as a teaching ground for sustainable farming rooted in Black traditions. Farmers from across the South traveled to learn from the Johnson model, taking home lessons about how ownership could be paired with communal growth. Each harvest festival grew larger, drawing visitors from across the nation, turning Evelyn's soil into sacred ground for all who sought healing through remembrance. But perhaps the most powerful transformation came in law and policy. Inspired by Evelyn's precedent-setting case, states began enacting new protections against land theft and exploitation. Title companies were required to investigate deeper histories before clearing development. Federal grants were issued to help families recover lost deeds. A national conversation about reparations found new footing, anchored in Evelyn's undeniable proof that justice was not theoretical. It was possible. Evelyn's story became a cornerstone of curriculum in Black studies programs. Professors taught her not as a singular miracle, but as an example of what happens when patience, dignity, and strategy meet opportunity. Law students dissected her case in classrooms, learning that justice requires not only knowledge of the system, but the courage to hold it accountable. Her words were quoted alongside giants of history, her life woven into the fabric of America's unfinished struggle for equality. Generations later, young activists carried her banner into new fights: housing discrimination, gentrification, and systemic displacement. They invoked Evelyn's name in chants at rallies, painted her likeness on signs, and used her blueprint of patience and precision to dismantle modern forms of erasure. Evelyn had not lived to see it, but her trap had caught something far greater than an HOA. It had caught the imagination of the people. And yet, amidst the national recognition, her land remained the heart of it all. The subdivision was no longer managed by an HOA, nor was it simply a collection of houses. It was a cooperative, owned collectively by residents under the stewardship of the Johnson Legacy Foundation. Families lived there with the knowledge that their homes stood on sacred soil that demanded respect. They told newcomers the story of Evelyn before handing over keys, reminding them that to live there was to be part of a living lesson in justice. Every Juneteenth, the community gathered on Evelyn's porch, which had been preserved as a historic site. Children ran barefoot through the grass. Elders told stories and songs rose into the night sky, and each year someone repeated Evelyn's words. As long as this land is ours, they can never say we had nothing. Her story even crossed oceans. In Africa, scholars studied her case as part of the global history of land dispossession. In the Caribbean, activists invoked her legacy in fights against development projects, threatening family-owned lands. Evelyn's name became international, a symbol of the shared struggles of Black people worldwide to reclaim what had been stripped from them. But perhaps the most profound legacy lived not in institutions or laws, but in the quiet ways her story shaped identity. Black children who had grown up hearing Evelyn's name learned to stand taller when discussing their families. They spoke with pride about ownership, about land, about inheritance, not as abstract ideas but as living truths. Evelyn had given them permission to imagine themselves as heirs, not as outsiders. One evening, 50 years after her passing, the Johnson subdivision held a commemorative service in her honor. Thousands gathered: residents, activists, scholars, and strangers who had been moved by her story. The air was heavy with memory and gratitude. As the sun dipped below the horizon, a young girl stepped to the microphone. Her voice was small but clear, her words trembling with conviction. "My name is Aliyah," she said. "My family was helped by the Johnson Foundation. When we found out our land had been stolen years ago, because of Miss Evelyn, we got it back. And I just want to say, she showed us that traps don't have to destroy. They can teach. They can protect. They can heal. And because of her, we know we are not powerless. We are not invisible. We are here." The crowd erupted into applause, and in that moment, Evelyn's legacy felt eternal. She had set a trap for arrogance and ignorance. But what she caught was far greater. She caught the future. Her name lived not in silence, but in song, not in bitterness, but in pride. Evelyn Johnson had become more than a woman, more than a case, more than a subdivision. She had become proof that when justice is claimed with patience and dignity, it can ripple through centuries. Her land remained firm beneath the feet of those who carried her story forward. And so, even long after her passing, the soil whispered her truth to all who walked upon it. Justice is possible. Dignity is unshakable. And legacy is forever. History is rarely a straight line. It bends, it breaks, it heals, and it begins again. Evelyn Johnson's story, her quiet trap, her patient victory, her legacy, was not an isolated miracle. It was a chapter in a much larger book, a book written in the blood, sweat, and resilience of Black people who had fought for ownership in a world determined to deny them. To understand the magnitude of her legacy, one must look backward. Land has always been both promise and weapon in America. After emancipation, freedmen dreamed of 40 acres and a mule, a promise that was whispered but never kept. Instead, Reconstruction's fragile hope was met with backlash, lynchings, burning deeds, and violent dispossession. Families who had managed to save pennies to buy farmland watched it vanish under forged signatures, fraudulent contracts, and courts that never ruled in their favor. Generations of Black farmers lost millions of acres, their names erased from records, their dignity stolen alongside their soil. Evelyn knew this history intimately. It lived in her bones, carried through the stories of her grandmother and the quiet tears of her father. And when she faced the theft of her own land, she carried not only her family's burden, but the collective memory of all who had been silenced before her. That was why her victory resonated so deeply. It was not simply one woman winning against one. It was centuries of struggle finding voice, centuries of erasure finally stopped in its tracks. Her case became a rallying point for the growing reparations movement. Scholars cited her story as tangible proof of how wealth and dignity had been stolen, not in abstract theories, but in measurable acres and deeds. Politicians who once dismissed restitution as impossible found themselves confronted with Evelyn's undeniable precedent. The land was stolen. The land was reclaimed. Justice was possible. Her story made the intangible real. In classrooms, Evelyn's name was spoken alongside Sojourner Truth, Ida B. Wells, Fannie Lou Hamer, and Shirley Chisholm. She was not a politician, not a preacher, not a celebrity. She was something even more powerful, a woman who had taken the tools of the system and used them against it. A woman who proved that patience could be sharper than rage, that dignity could be deadlier than vengeance. Her trap was not only legal, it was spiritual, historical, ancestral. Globally, her influence spread. In South Africa, her case was studied in conversations about land restitution after apartheid. In Brazil, activists invoked her name in fights against displacement of Afro-Brazilian communities. In the Caribbean, her legacy was woven into calls for reparations from colonial powers. Evelyn had become more than American history. She had become part of the global language of justice. Yet her story was not only about law and land. It was about dignity. Dignity is a quiet power, one that cannot be bulldozed or erased. Evelyn embodied that dignity every time she walked her property at night, holding her papers, whispering prayers to the ancestors. She carried it into the courtroom, where she stood unshaken by expensive lawyers. She carried it into the town hall, where she faced 96 families with calm strength. And she carried it into her final days, watching children harvest vegetables from soil once threatened by greed. Her legacy reminds us that dignity is not soft. It is iron. It is the backbone of justice. It is the reason why, even centuries after enslavement, Black people continued to claim ownership, to plant crops, to build homes, to hold on to deeds as sacred scripture. Evelyn was one link in that unbreakable chain. In the years after her passing, The Johnson Legacy Foundation expanded its work to include global partnerships. They built programs in Africa, Latin America, and the Caribbean, connecting families across the diaspora who shared the same scars of land theft and dispossession. They hosted international conferences where Black farmers, scholars, and activists gathered to share strategies, resources, and victories. And at the heart of every gathering was Evelyn's story, the woman who set a trap not of malice, but of truth. Her land, preserved as a historic site, became a pilgrimage ground. People traveled from across the world to walk her soil, to see the subdivision that had once been an act of erasure and had become a monument to justice. They touched the earth, some with tears in their eyes, whispering thanks to Evelyn and to the ancestors who stood behind her. The land spoke back, carrying her truth in every breeze, in every root, in every harvest. The children of the future grew up with her story not as something distant, but as something that belonged to them. They learned that justice was not only found in protests and speeches, but in the quiet, patient defense of what was already theirs. They learned that ownership was not only economic, it was spiritual. They learned that even when the world tries to erase you, you can hold your ground and remind it who you are. And so Evelyn Johnson's legacy became a bridge between past and future, between dispossession and restoration, between silence and voice. She stood not at the edges of history, but in its center, reminding the world that traps can be tools, that invisibility can be turned into power, that dignity can build legacies stronger than concrete. Her story teaches us that the land remembers. It remembers who walked upon it, who worked it, who loved it, and who tried to steal it. The land carried Evelyn's ancestors, it carried Evelyn herself, and it now carries the generations that came after. And as long as the land remembers, justice is never truly lost. Evelyn Johnson did not just defend her inheritance, she transformed it. She turned acres of dirt into sacred testimony, 96 houses into symbols of power, and one woman's fight into a global lesson. Her trap remains set, not for the next HOA or developer, but for history itself. It is a trap that catches arrogance, greed, and erasure, and replaces them with truth, pride, and legacy. And long after her name is carved in stone, the soil will still whisper her story. We are still here. We will always be here, and no one can erase us again. Legacies are not just what we leave behind. They are what live and breathe in the present. Evelyn Johnson's story, though rooted in her own soil, became a mirror for the world to see its reflection, raw, undeniable, and often uncomfortable. Her fight against the HOA was not just about her 14 acres. It was about every Black neighborhood facing bulldozers disguised as development, every family whose home was quietly bought out, every elder pressured to sign papers they could not read, every community erased by a new shopping center or luxury high-rise. Evelyn's name became shorthand for a much larger truth. They tried to bury us, but they forgot we are the seed. As her case spread through the media and later through history books, many began drawing parallels to gentrification, the modern face of land theft. Across cities, Black neighborhoods that had been home for generations were suddenly labeled as blighted. Developers came in, promising renewal, only for longtime residents to be priced out. Their cultural footprints erased beneath polished sidewalks and trendy cafes. The language was different, but the story was the same. Power versus people, greed versus dignity. Evelyn's victory gave these communities a rallying cry. If one woman could protect her land against 96 homes, what might an entire neighborhood accomplish if they stood together? Her trap became metaphorical as much as literal. She had shown that sometimes the most powerful weapon was patience, documentation, and an unwavering refusal to bend. Activists began calling their community defense strategies Evelyn's trap, methods of using zoning laws, environmental protections, and historic preservation to slow or stop unjust development. They taught workshops where elders learned how to safeguard deeds, where young people studied local ordinances to understand how land could be defended. Evelyn had turned survival into curriculum, but Evelyn's story also forced the nation to confront the deeper question. Why is it always Black land? Black homes, Black neighborhoods that are first to be targeted? The answer lay not in coincidence, but in centuries of systemic design. From redlining to predatory loans, from interstate highways, cutting through thriving Black, business districts to urban renewal projects, that displaced families by the thousands. The message had always been the same. Black space is disposable. Evelyn disrupted that message, proving that Black land was not only defensible but sacred. Her influence began to stretch into housing justice movements as well. Tenant unions invoked her name in battles against unfair evictions. Families in rural areas cited her case when fighting corporate farms trying to seize their land. Even indigenous communities, long dispossessed of their ancestral territories, found inspiration in her approach, calling her story a sister struggle in the shared fight against erasure. Evelyn's life had become more than personal victory. It had become connective tissue binding together global fights for belonging. But there was also a deeper lesson in her story, one not always spoken aloud. Evelyn's trap was only possible because she understood the value of invisibility. While the HOA ignored her, she observed them. While they built, she waited. While they dismissed her, she gathered strength. Invisibility, so often forced upon Black women, became her weapon. She taught the world that being unseen does not mean being powerless. Sometimes it means you are watching, planning, waiting for the exact moment when history tilts. This lesson resonated especially with Black women everywhere, who saw in Evelyn's story a reflection of their own experiences, overlooked, underestimated, yet holding families, communities, and movements together with quiet force. Evelyn's dignity was not loud, but it was unstoppable. She showed that the very thing used to silence, you could one day be the reason you win. Her legacy also called the question of wealth, what it is, who holds it, and how it is measured. 96 homes stood on her land, each one a symbol of middle-class aspiration, yet their foundations were stolen from a Black woman whose family had held that soil for generations. Who truly had wealth in that equation? The ones with mortgages and property, taxes, or the one with deeds? And ancestral memory? Evelyn redefined wealth as something beyond numbers in a bank. She taught that wealth was the ability to look at the land beneath your feet and say, "This is mine. This was my mother's. This will be my children's." In a society that so often equates dignity with money, Evelyn's story restored dignity to its rightful place. Not something bought, but something earned through resilience, patience, and integrity. Her land became proof that dignity could outlast dollars, that justice could outshine profit, and yet, even with her victory, Evelyn's story was not romanticized. She did not end her days in luxury, nor did she seek fame. She lived as she had always lived, quietly, rooted, steady. That, perhaps, was her final gift to the world. She showed that justice need not always be loud to be transformative. Sometimes it is the quiet reclamation of what was always yours that shakes the earth the most. Her name lived on in movements, in songs, in classrooms, and in whispered conversations across kitchen tables. Parents told their children about Evelyn not as a distant figure but as a reminder. You, too, can hold your ground. You, too, can set your trap. You, too, can win against those who believe you are powerless. And so Evelyn's story became not just history, but prophecy. A prophecy that Black neighborhoods facing gentrification could resist, that families threatened with eviction could endure, that dignity, though often tested, could never be destroyed. She became a living parable of what it meant to be underestimated, and how underestimation could become the very soil in which victory grows. For Evelyn Johnson, the land was always more than acres. It was memory. It was battle. It was dignity. And now it was legacy. The years rolled on, and Evelyn Johnson's story became woven into the very fabric of the land she had fought to protect. Generations came and went, yet the soil beneath the 96 homes remained a constant reminder that courage and patience could withstand time. Children who once ran through her gardens now returned with their own children, telling stories of the woman who had refused to be erased, who had set a trap not for revenge but for truth. In schools, Evelyn's name was recited alongside historical giants, her story no longer a singular victory, but a symbol of what Black people could achieve when legacy, courage, and wisdom intersected. Teachers told students that Evelyn had not only defended her land, she had defended the dignity of every Black family whose claim had been denied, every community whose voice had been silenced, and every child who had been taught that ownership could be stolen. Her life was proof that one person, armed with truth and patience, could bend the arc of injustice. Across the country, the Johnson Legacy Foundation continued to grow, its influence spreading further than Evelyn could have imagined. Programs for land preservation, legal advocacy, and educational scholarships flourished. Communities once on the brink of erasure found guidance and support. Evelyn's trap, the strategy, the patience, the foresight became a blueprint not only for defending property, but for defending dignity itself. Yet it was the personal, quiet victories that remained most profound. In the subdivision, families thrived. carrying Evelyn's story in the very way they lived. Children harvested crops from the gardens she had planted. Elders passed down her teachings of resilience, and every resident, regardless of their arrival date, understood the sacredness of the ground beneath their feet. Her land was no longer just property, it was living history, a testament to Black perseverance, pride, and justice. As decades passed, her story transcended borders. Scholars in Africa, the Caribbean, and South America cited her as a modern exemplar of reclaiming stolen land. Activists in cities worldwide used her example to galvanize their own communities. Evelyn's triumph had grown into a movement, proving that one person's vigilance and determination could echo across generations and continents. And yet, the most enduring aspect of Evelyn's legacy was the way it lived in the hearts of children. One afternoon, a young girl named Amara, granddaughter of a family who had benefited from the Johnson Foundation, wandered through the gardens, her small hands brushing the leaves. She asked her mother about Evelyn, who knelt beside her, smiling. "She was a woman who refused to be erased," her mother said. "She showed us that the land, the history, and our dignity belong to us, and no one can take that if we hold on." Amara's eyes sparkled with understanding. She carried the same resolve, the same quiet strength that Evelyn had embodied so fully. Evelyn's story also became a call to reflection for the nation. It asked society to examine the systems that allowed land to be stolen, communities to be displaced, and Black voices to be silenced. It asked, what does justice truly mean when ownership is intertwined with history and identity? And it offered an answer. Justice is not only in courts or legislation, it is in courage, patience, and the unwavering commitment to protect what is rightfully yours. As the sun set over the Johnson subdivision, casting a golden glow across the houses, the gardens, and the museum she had founded, it was clear that Evelyn Johnson's life had achieved something extraordinary. She had transformed a personal fight into a universal lesson, one that would continue to inspire, educate, and empower. Her trap had been sprung decades ago, yet its effect was timeless, a demonstration that dignity, once claimed, could never be erased. Families gathered on her porch for the annual Juneteenth celebration, singing, telling stories, and honoring the woman who had made all of it possible. Her presence was felt in every laugh, every whispered story, every hand planted in the soil she had fought to protect. And though Evelyn herself was no longer there, she remained alive in the choices her community made, in the courage they carried, and in the legacy that would endure forever. Her story had become a parable for the world, that even when systems of power conspire to erase you, even when arrogance and greed threaten your inheritance, dignity can be your shield, patience your weapon, and courage your path. Evelyn Johnson had shown that victory is not measured solely by the courts or by the houses one owns, but by the lives one inspires, the truths one preserves, and the future one secures. The final lesson of Evelyn Johnson's life was simple, yet profound. Ownership is more than property. It is history, memory, and identity. Protect it, respect it, and never let it be diminished. She had turned her fight into a beacon, guiding future generations to hold fast to their inheritance, their dignity, and their voice. And so, as night fell over the subdivision, the wind whispered through the gardens, across the porches and over the historic homes, carrying the essence of Evelyn's legacy. Her trap had caught more than an HOA. It had captured the imagination, resilience, and pride of generations. Her land, her story, and her spirit would endure, a reminder that justice, once claimed, is unstoppable. Evelyn Johnson's name will always be spoken where Black history, dignity, and resilience are honored. She was more than a woman, more than a landowner, more than a case in a courthouse. She was a testament to the power of patience, courage, and truth. She was living proof that a single person, armed with knowledge and integrity, can reshape not only their world, but the world for everyone who comes after. And in the heart of the land she defended, her legacy continues, unbroken, unbowed, and forever reminding us that justice, dignity, and pride are timeless.